Hello, everyone. My name is Veronica Sullivan, and I'm so honoured to host this panel today. Shifting genres, challenging forms and crossing genres with three incredible creative souls. This event is presented in partnership with the Service 95 Book Club. I don't know if you knew that, but that's Dua Lipa's book club. So if you're here, Dua, hello. So I'm going to introduce our speakers, and I really want to read the versions of their bios that I have in full because you've all done a lot of different kinds of things, and we're going to talk about as many of them as possible today. So I'll start with Omar, who's to my immediate left. Omar Musa is an author, a visual artist, a rapper and a poet. He's released 4 poetry books, including Killer Nova, and 4 hip-hop records. In 2015, he was named one of the Sydney Morning Herald's Young Novelists of the Year. His debut novel, Here Come the Dogs, was longlisted for both the International Dublin Literary Award and the Miles Franklin Literary Award, which is Australia's most prestigious literary award. His one-man play, Since Ali Died, won Best Cabaret Show at the Sydney Theatre Awards in 2018. He's performed at venues such as the Brixton Academy in London, the Brooklyn Academy of Music in New York City, and the National Museum in Brasilia, Brazil. He's based between Brooklyn and Borneo. And then in the middle of our 3 speakers, we have Felix Cheong. Felix is the author of 25 books across different genres, including poetry, short stories, children's picture books, and graphic novels. His works have been widely anthologised and used in O and A-level exams. He's been nominated for the prestigious Frank O'Connor Award and the Singapore Literature Prize. His latest work, one of his latest works, is Sprawl, God's Lonely Man, a graphic novel in collaboration with Malaysian artist Arif Rahman. He's also written multiple opera librettos, was conferred the Young Artist Award by the National Arts Council in 2000, and is an adjunct lecturer with Murdoch University, Curtin University, Singapore University of Social Sciences, and the National University of Singapore. And finally, on the end, Nam Le. Nam is the author of The Boat, On David Malouf, and 36 Ways of Writing a Vietnamese Poem. These are books of short stories, monograph, and poetry, respectively. His work, which appears in Modern Classic series, has received major awards in Australia, America, and Europe, and is widely translated, anthologised, and taught. His poetry has been published in the Paris Review, The Monthly, Granta, and elsewhere, and he lives in Melbourne. Please join me in welcoming our incredible panellists today. All right, I want to start by asking each of you how you think about your own creative practices, because as we've just heard, there are many different forms in which you work and play and mix. And so I'd like to ask each of you what the first form or genre that you produced creative work in was, whether that was published or unpublished, however you think about that when you reflect on your creative work, whether it was childhood or adulthood. What was your first creative form? And how would you characterise the journey that you've been on since then through different creative forms and genres? Omar, would you like to start?
Sure. Thank you for having me here. It's always a pleasure to be in Bali. I just love it here. I come from an artistic family, so my mother is a theatre critic and was a theatre director. My father was an actor and a poet and a romance radio DJ in Malaysia. And so I grew up surrounded by the arts. My mum was running a little independent arts magazine in Canberra in Australia when I was growing up. And so it sort of didn't feel like something strange to express myself through the arts. And I guess it was my Aussie grandma who first really got me going, though, because whenever she'd come down from Sydney, she'd bring me a present for Christmas, which was usually some Derwent pencils or, oil pastels. And so actually it was drawing and painting that was my first love, well before I ever got into poetry. But then I think, maybe in primary school, it was poetry that I wanted to express myself through. And my dad would tell me oftentimes that in Malaysia, poetry wasn't just reserved for dusty pages or academic halls, but it was something to be performed with full body and spirit, not just Malaysia, but Indonesia as well. And one of the previous speakers at Ubud Writers Festival maybe about 10 years ago, I think, V.S. Rendra, one of the most famous Indonesian poets that ever lived. I met him when I was about 8 years old. He came on tour through Canberra, and I remember my dad said, "You see this guy? He's a poet. But when he performs, it's not just in empty rooms. He performs to stadiums full of people, political rallies, and it's dangerous. You know, it's something that's important, and people sometimes will even threw bombs on stage like while he was performing, because that's how dangerous his poetry was and subversive his poetry was considered. And so from that young age, I was like, that's the type of poetry that I want to make. And so when I found hip-hop music in my teens, that was what I guess brought my poetry more to life. And then it continued from there. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. We'll throw some metaphorical bombs today, maybe. Felix, how about you?
Well, for me, it was more like poetry chose me rather than I chose poetry. So I started, actually English is not my first language. I spoke, I think, mainly Cantonese all the way till I was 5 or 6, because my parents were both illiterate. And we didn't speak English at home, and we spoke mainly Cantonese. But the turning point came when I started watching Sesame Street. I'm sure most of you might have grown up watching Sesame Street, and that was when I learned my alphabets and my counting and so on. So when I was in primary school, I was a diligent student, as most Singaporeans are. I studied, and I got a book prize at the end of my primary 1. It was a book prize, and I cherished that book. And my mom was so proud of me. So I thought one day I wanted to become a writer to make her feel proud of me, that she produced this child who eventually became a writer. So I started writing a lot of short stories, and I was published when I was primary 6. I think that's 12 years old, my first short story in a student's magazine. And that got me motivated. So by the time I was 14, I decided I was born to be a writer. Nobody in my family tree, whether on my paternal side or maternal side, was ever a writer or is ever a writer. So I'm quite of the mutation in the family tree. And poetry became more important to me as I grew older. I remember my first poem was to my classmate when I was in junior college. I wanted to woo her with a poem, you know, the old-fashioned way. So I wrote a poem for her, handwritten in a card, gave it to her for Valentine's Day. But of course, and her name is, strangely, Veronica.
Ah.
I still remember her name. But of course, Odin said, poetry makes nothing happen. So, nothing happened. But I was motivated enough to continue pursuing the form. So by the time I got to university, I started exploring different forms, different ways of writing poetry. I had a mentor in a Singapore poet. The dream to become a published writer didn't get realized until I was 33. By then, I had quite a few manuscripts rejected, which was good for the soul, because rejection really toughens you up. And by now, I still write a lot of poetry, although it mutates itself in different forms, in different genres. And that's my current writing practice, in the form of graphic novels, librettos, children's picture books, etc.
Beautiful. Thank you. I love how our poetry morphs across your different works, but it's always very present. Yeah. Nam, how about you?
Oh, geez, I'm just so saddened by your story, and I was half hoping that you would get down on one knee in front of this Veronica, and it's a full circle.
Nothing like that.
It's a happy ending. Listening to Omar especially speak about the poetry and the status and energy of the poetry that inspired you through your father, brings to mind 6 months ago I was in the States, speaking of saying poetry into empty rooms. And I was at a bookstore in Chicago, and there were 4 people in the audience. 3 of them were my friends, and then there was 1 woman at the back. And so I and my interlocutor thought, you know what, we're doing this. We're doing this. And so we had this incredible conversation, me and Eula Biss, and we just, at the end of it, we thought, that was a great conversation, you know. And the one woman who was not my friend did not buy a book. And just so I had one person to a captive audience to impress, and I think that's more the story of my journey through poetry than yours, Omar, or yours, Felix. I think, but similarly to you, Omar, I started out in enthrallment to visual arts. It was drawing. It was you know, when you could afford a pastel, let alone like a gouache or a you know, heaven forbid, an oil. And canvas was so expensive, and paper was so expensive, and that was the dream, was to be able to sort of communicate through that. And being, you know, of Asian extraction, I was also forced into music lessons from a young age, and that also became an abiding love. And so in terms of the written word, I think poetry was the first thing that really stuck in terms of writing, because I did not come from an ostensibly artistic family. We were very much the stereotypical immigrant family where parents were working 3 jobs, and so what would happen is they would often just drop me off at the library, and that would be my de facto childcare for, you know, for after school and for entire holiday periods. So the entire, you know, 2, 3 weeks, 6 weeks of holidays would sort of get dropped off when the library opened, hang out there for hours and hours, and then sort of get picked up. And I couldn't believe that it was free, it was there, and it was all allowed. Like, you could just go up to any book and no one would sort of slap it out of your hand, and no one would tell you, you can't do that or you can't read this. And so I sort of, not knowing any better, sort of just read from left to right. I didn't have any other logic of how to read, but I think that really helped in the sense of I read across genres. I read, I think, mythologies of the, you know, of the globe first, and then sort of moved to various non-fictional sort of stuff, and then I was reading like magazines, and just enchanted by all of it. And so I still remember the first poem that I tried to write was a rip-off of The Highwayman. It's this poem that has this really strong rhythm. You know, the highwayman came riding, riding, riding. And so I totally just ripped that off. And I can't remember what it was, but it was something like, you know, and the baker went baking, baking, baking. and yeah, the rest is me speaking into an empty room.
Incredible. We've gone so many places with you there. That's amazing. And I love how you all have, you know, there's clearly a lot of love for poetry in the room and on the stage today. And I hope we will have a chance to hear some poetry throughout the conversation that we'll have. Nam, I want to just continue with you for a moment and talk about 36 Ways of Writing a Vietnamese Poem, and ask you about your, I suppose, your career in the sense of this being your latest work. So looking back at The Boat, which was your debut and was a short story collection, which was released at a time when I think the received wisdom was still that short story collections were not saleable or marketable. But it was, you know, hugely successful critically and commercially, both in Australia and abroad. And I think then and still now there's a tendency for debut short story collections to be viewed as the precursor to a novel and to be the first step on the way to a novel. And I know that you have been working on a novel for a long time. And I'm sure there's a lot of pressure from readers and perhaps from publishers, or I wouldn't want to presume, but that there may be some pressures on you to produce the novel. So I'm very interested that, you know, it's been a long time since The Boat. You produced a beautiful monograph on the Australian writer David Malouf in 2019, and now this really glorious poetry collection. And I wonder whether releasing the poetry collection, has that felt freeing at all, or enabled you to sidestep some of those expectations about what the path of a fiction writer should be?
Oh, thank you. It's really astute. That would be the word that I would use, is freeing. And the story of this book is, as you alluded to, one that, shall we say, no one was happy to receive the manuscript of of this in lieu of what I was contracted to do. Not in lieu of, because I'm still doing stuff. But there was a real sense that I had to, not a sense, there was the reality that I really had to fight for this book. And it sort of met with a lot of resistance from various stakeholders. Sorry, I'm cutting out, aren't I?
Yeah.
Maybe if I just face this way. Sorry, Veronica. And I don't want to get too much into how the sausage gets made, but I think I had been writing poetry for some time, and I had and have enough poems for a collection that wasn't this book. And there was no part of me that figured, that can't wait, I want to get this novel done, and I'm happy to hold that off until the novel's done and move on, because of just a sense of obligation, but also respect for the publishers that have signed me. But when I wrote this book, I realised that I couldn't wait, and it was a book that sort of situated where I was in my work, in my thinking, and it was a book that, in a way, was a legend for the stuff before and the stuff to come. And it felt to me as though if I could manage just to get this out there, then I could feel sort of comfortable in myself that there was a guide to what I was trying to do for those who wanted to look for it. And so I did. Yeah, at some risk, I had to sort of fight for this book. And now that it's out, it does feel freeing. It does feel as though it has freed me to think and play in other spaces. And I think in a sense, I wouldn't want to presume, but I would be confident that everyone on this stage has in some way had to incorporate into their work the right to make that work and the space to make that work, away from the various sort of labels and boxes and pigeonholes into which you might get stuck. And so I think the idea of space carving is one that is very dear to me, and I now realise it's one that is going to be a life's work. It's not something that you do as a throat clearing and then you say the thing. It's actually wefted into the thing itself.
Beautiful. Yeah, I'd love to know whether that resonates with you, Felix and Omar, in terms of whether you have felt pressure or desire, whether it's external or internal, to maybe do something that's more conventional or easy is maybe not quite the right word, but in terms of the twists and turns that your creative expression has taken. And Omar, you used the words expressing yourself when you were talking about your creativity earlier. Are there times where you've had to really actively not be affected by external forces in terms of what that next step is? Omar?
Definitely, yeah. I can relate a lot to what Nam's saying, because we've had this conversation many times privately as well. I think growing up as a Muslim man in the post 9/11 era in Australia, oftentimes people have wanted to essentialize my identity, and so oftentimes put me into the role of being some type of spokesperson, which made me very, very uncomfortable and maybe expected a certain type of work out of me. And I have often resisted that and resisted the simplification of my identity through complexifying my work itself in terms of genre, so that the borderless work that I seek to create also reflects my unpinnable identity, where I don't fit neatly into a box. Because actually, when Nam very kindly launched my first novel, Here Come the Dogs, and I remember he said in the speech that the boxes they put you in diminish you as soon as they put you in them. And resisting that type of diminishment and essentialized identity is something that I think is really important. And And so, yeah, I can also relate to the idea of being freed by a piece of work that isn't necessarily the one that your publisher wants from you. We can get onto it, but my recent book of poetry is one that is also a visual art book. And, you know, I've been working on my sophomore novel for about 12 years now. And I think this book of poetry and art, I didn't realize it, but it was the one that I had to put out there in order to free myself to put out the second novel. So, yeah. I can relate a lot to what Nam's saying.
I can relate to what the two gentlemen have said, because even for this festival itself, I was initially put in an event typically about poetry. And I told the festival director, could you not put me in another poetry event again? Can I try something else about shifting genres? And they said, oh, okay, there's this particular event that we can slot you in. So and this is the event. So it's been an uphill battle in Singapore for the past 5 to 6 years for me, trying to break out of these boxes. Because every time I put out something new, something that's genre breaking, people will say, but you're a poet, why would you be doing this? Why would you be publishing children's picture books? So the circles, the community within Singapore, and we are often seen like a big fish bowl, we often close off in our own little silos. So the children's picture book writers will be in their own little community, those who do comics and graphic novels in their own community. So they get a little suspicious of me when I try to encroach on their territory. They saw me as an outsider trying to break in, a trespasser, if you will. And it was very hard initially to get published and be recognized. It took me a while. I even had to for example, write journal articles to talk about my craft, my writing practice in trying to break into comics, into graphic novels. And each particular community has its own gatekeepers. For example, when I finished a series of monologues, dramatic monologues, and I thought that could be staged, I tried shopping it around to different theatre companies, and they shut me out. Almost to a person, they shut me out. So it was hard to break into that circle. I'm sure the two gentlemen here would agree that when you try to break out of a particular genre, you are often kind of cut off.
Yeah.
I suspect that that request to the festival might have been the genesis of this panel existing, you know? So thank you for bringing us here.
Thank you.
I think we should hear a reading, and maybe, Felix, if you'd like to share something with us, that would be wonderful.
I'd like to read you something from this graphic novel called The Shogun and the Minister. So this is a curious historical incident back in 1966. I was doing research on another project, another graphic novel, and I came across this curious fact that Singapore's second chief minister, who eventually lost the elections in 1959 to Lee Kuan Yew, he became a Malaysian. At that point, when Singapore became independent, you had a choice to either become a Malaysian or Singaporean. So he chose to become a Malaysian, and he was appointed by then Malaysian Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman as the Australia's High Commissioner to Australia, Malaysia's High Commissioner to Australia. But curiously, in 1966, he disappeared for 10 days. No sound, nothing. You can Google this, I'm not making this up. He disappeared for 10 days, and there were rumors that he was involved with a stripper in King's Cross. And there were a lot of these interesting tangents that I could pull together strands. At that time, of course, in 1966, there was the Cold War. It was at its peak. There was the confrontasi between Indonesia and Malaysia and Singapore. There was also flower power. It was at its height. And there were these different strands that kind of turning point in history, a confluence of circumstances. I thought too good to miss out to create an espionage novel, a graphic novel. And I wrote it in poetic form. So the entire graphic novel is written in couplets. I'll just read you a couple of the opening chapter. Oh, the name of the minister is Lim Yu Hock, but for purposes of legality, I changed his name to Lim Hui Hock. Quite similar. Similar enough for you to be able to do research on, but not similar enough for me to be sued. 6 years after leaving office, Lim Hui Hock is still within arm's reach of politics as Malaysia's High Commissioner to Australia. You don't climb from being a clerk to the second Chief Minister of Singapore, ruling the roost for 3 years without ambition kicking into gear. Hindsight is an easy starter for conversation when he's already out of the action. Riding high in the diplomatic circle, he has the ear of his Prime Minister. He's living the great life with fine wine, urbane banter, and the occasional flutter. Here in Australia, little more is asked of him than to wait it out. Not unlike that face in the crowd, coming into focus before becoming someone else. Except when pockets get light and a getaway just a hairbreadth too tight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Felix. And it is an incredible work of imagination about a totally bizarre incident that sent me down some really great Wikipedia rabbit holes, and I highly recommend it because it's just, it's so bizarre, but what you've created is this really rich kind of swirling international network of spies and gangsters and sex workers and ordinary people and politicians, and it's so alive.
In fact, that's my current writing practice, trying to find these gaps of history. Like, for example, my current project is about the Koro syndrome in 1967. I don't know whether you're familiar with this. Apparently, back in 1967, between October to November in Singapore, more than 500 men claimed that their penises had shrunk. I'm not kidding you. Google this. It's a fact. And there's this deep rabbit hole I could dive into about why these 500 men, they went to the A&E to report that their penises had shrunk. And it was a mass hysteria. There was actually nothing wrong with them. The members were still, membership has its privileges, but the members were still there, just that they believe in their heart of hearts that it has shrunk back into the body. And they use all kinds of mechanical means to clamp their penises down. So they use wooden apparatus, they use rubber bands, they use strings, they use ropes, and they will rush to the hospital claiming, "Please help me, my penis has shrunk." So I found this curious little incident and trying to weave a whole story, a whole graphic novel around it. So as they say in Bahasa, akan datang.
Hey.
Coming soon.
Amazing.
It's also published by Penguin.
That is amazing, and I imagine your illustrative collaborator was thrilled with that brief.
Well, we try to keep it a bit PG.
Actually, on that note, I'd love to ask you about collaboration because it is something that you do a lot of in your work, whether that's in your libretto writing with your musical composers. The Showgirl and the Minister is your fourth graphic novel with comics artist Arif Rafan. Your poetry book, The Mischief of Ordinary Things, is a kind of poem, ekphrastic poems inspired by artworks. And I'd love to know how that kind of creative interplay with your collaborators enriches your creative practice, and what a really great creative collaboration feels like when you're working on it.
It feels like jumping on a trampoline. Because when you're on your own, no matter how hard you try to jump, there's a certain level at which your human capability, your creativity can reach. But with a collaborator, you're bouncing off the other person's creativity. I think it helps to be able to reach higher, much further if you had that trampoline to jump onto.
Yeah, beautiful. Omar, I also want to ask you about collaboration because your latest kind of performance work that you've been touring, including last night at the festival, if anyone was lucky enough to go along, is a musical storytelling project with your wife, Marielle, who's a cellist. Can you tell us about how you developed that work and what that collaborative process has been like for you?
The Offering? Yeah. Yeah, my wife's a cellist, and we did a gig in New York City together just to test out whether we vibed on stage, and it turned out that we did, because it's not always a given, obviously, if you're in a relationship with somebody, that it would also work performance-wise. She's classically trained, but does a lot of really out there kind of experimental music, and sort of beats up the cello in any number of ways so that it makes these quite harsh, discordant sounds as well as the really beautiful, sweet ones. And we found that it kind of worked as a really perfect backdrop to poetry, and that both the words and the music enriched each other. And so I wanted to write about borderlessness, especially, and also statelessness, in between eastern Borneo, where I'm living at the moment, and the southern Philippines, because those are waters where my ancestors, the Suluk people, have been sailing for thousands of years. But since the kind of invention of the nation state, there's been all sorts of problems with poverty and inequality and people not having documents. And so I kind of wanted to write about that world over this sound bed, but we decided to enrich it by also, Marielle would take highly sensitive aquaphones or geophones and insert them into 1,000-year-old trees in the jungle in Borneo to record the sound of the sap moving within the tree. And it sounds like something that's sort of almost a combination between a human heartbeat and the crashing waves of an ocean, because that ancient tree is a body within itself, you know. And so we used those soundscapes. We used recordings from the coral reef itself, so that you could literally hear the landscape communicating, or the seascape communicating, so that it was telling its story in a way while we were telling our story over it, so that it almost became like a collaboration within itself with the environment. And so I began to use scraps of material that I had in this book, Killanova, that were kind of little vignettes or memories of childhood, going to Borneo from Australia, hanging out with family, and then kind of built a very simple kind of scaffold, like narrative scaffolding around it, of a nameless water spirit trying to find land, trying to find a piece of land, which was also sort of supposed to reflect, the experiences of, migrants, undocumented people, refugees, things like that, and then kind of use these little visions of the world as it is to create something kind of more apocalyptic and strange. And so a lot of it was quite spontaneous and kind of freestyle, because Marielle does a lot of improvisation. And so we kind of had these set pieces, but then a lot of it we had to just kind of work on the fly and just kind of get in the room and start making sounds and, letting shit get weird, basically. and that's how we came up with it.
Incredible. What an incredible swirl of ideas and impressions and art. On that note, and you just referred to Killanova, I wonder if you'd share something with us.
Sure. I might do something that's in Killanova and in The Offering. Unfortunately, I can't dance. I've long wished that I could, but hopefully I can make the words dance. And this is inspired by a type of dance from the southern Philippines and eastern Borneo called the pangalay, and it means an offering. And so this is my offering. Bodies and water. Bodies of water. 7,000 bodies in water. Maintain posture. Bent forwards in reverence, torsos to sun, shoulders cliffs and eyes downcast. Demure? No. Playful? Forever. Palm leaves flutter flit like lashes. Somatic temples conceived from volcanic ash. This movement mirrors migratory birds. And the thin topaz horizon is dimming now. Tonight, maintain posture. Twist wrists inward and outward with winds and tides. Form hands from sand and rock. Your promontories and bays will hold bones, hold docks, hold call to prayer. Hold steady the torch that blades across the face of the deep. Waves hip toss beneath woven sheets, purple and garnet, mulberry and mangosteen peel. In this dying light, your sarong is a sail. Now tie it to an upright oar and speak life into the vessel. Run your hands along the blood-spilt grain, worn by souls, salt worn of plagues, dying kisses and childbirth. For what it's worth, we have been here many times already. You know it well already. The jubilant fears, distilled tears now. Brass fingernails tremble to read ripples, read tides, read throats, read nipples, read steaming broth with salted fish and butterfly tongue. Vocabulary palls, then shreds in vapor. Think Sanskrit, think dances, choreographed in collaboration with the waves and the stars. Now melt the stars down to a single golden ingot. Wear it on a chain of islands forevermore. It will illuminate your faces, the privileged, the hateful, the hurtful, the stateless. The refuse of the world has atomized here. My ancestral oceans, a great gyre of plastic, rising, 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 like blood pressure in the giant's corrupted body. You see, monsters are being made out of trash, and a leviathan is crawling over a single-use horizon, but still, fish scales turn alabaster on the belly of the moon. We remain angels with fishermen's hands. Muslim animists, capitalist Christians, dried blood between thumb and forefinger configured together to point the way forward for. We are all trilingual, not so deep down. Speak God, speak flesh, speak ocean, speak up. Marshal your arts, pivot, twist, bend back like a bow, stay flexible as a borderline, stay controlled, because if your limbs in patterns seamlessly unfold, then the dance, sayang, the dance will never die. So maintain posture. The faster the beat, the slower the movement. The faster the world spins, the slower our movements. We make an offering tonight to you. This here is our offering. Thank you. That was a bit long.
That was incredible. Yeah, that was really amazing. And it's so beautiful spoken or performed. It's always interesting when you read something on the page and then you hear it aloud and it attains a new dimension. But it is really effective on the page, and this book is really effective in bringing together images and poetry and your beautiful woodcut carvings that you've been working on for several years. And as you spoke to a little earlier in terms of your trajectory, Omar, this is your first published work that has had that visual element to it. And you write in the introduction for the book, you say that the genesis for it came when you were burnt out and you'd lost your love for writing and performing, and that you realised you were looking for a new way to express yourself. But what? I certainly didn't expect it would be something visual. Can you talk about how you came to that visual medium and what surprised you the most about and how it helped you rediscover that love?
Yeah, I'd had like a dark night of the soul, but it was more like a dark few years of the soul, dealing with pretty heavy addiction and depression, and yeah, I kind of came to this realization that I hated the thing that I thought was my life's passion, which was writing and performing, and that was super confronting because I sort of thought, well, who am I then, and what's my life worth? And I actually went on a river journey in eastern Borneo, eastern Kalimantan, on the Indonesian side, because I wanted to go to the heart of the island of my homeland, the island of my ancestors. And so I took the public ferry from Samarinda on the east coast for about 6 days, just going up the river. And while I was up there, I saw a lot of beautiful Dayak carvings, the strata of the longhouses carved with different spirits and animals. And I suddenly realized that, I needed a new medium to express myself with. But how I was going to access that, I wasn't sure. And then I'm not sure I believe in fate, but maybe 2 weeks later, I went back to Malaysian Borneo and I was performing at an artistic retreat. And this guy called Arik Lost Control, a local punk rocker. Lost Control is not his government name. But he was running a workshop on woodcut printing and how to carve the wood, roll it with ink, and then press it to paper or cloth using your feet, which was taught. It's a very Southeast Asian thing to do, because this collective he was part of, Punk Rock Sulap, an activist collective, they were actually taught by Taring Padi, who's like the most famous activist woodcut collective from Indonesia, who also cross genres in terms of using punk rock music and everything like that. And so he gave me a V-shaped tool, taught me how to carve away from my fingers so that I wouldn't cut them up. And then he just told me to carve what was in my soul, you know, and I carved I was sick of making work about ugly, violent things, which was what I'd kind of been preoccupied with in a lot of my work. And so I wanted to carve the most beautiful thing I knew, which was the Bornean clouded leopard. And so I carved this leopard into the wood, and then I couldn't help myself because it felt like too much of a leap just to do something visual. I carved a little line of poetry that just said, "When the loggers are away, the leopards will play." And I printed it up, and I guess that started my journey, because he was amazed. He was like, "Are you sure you haven't done this before?" And I was like, "No, I never have." And I don't want to get too woo-woo about it, but every tribe in Borneo carves wood, and my ancestors have carved wood. My uncle carves wood. Like, you know, whether you're a person of the ocean carving the prows of boats with beautiful floral designs, or those, you know, strata of the beams in the longhouses, everyone carves wood in Borneo. And so I felt like it was something that was flowing in my veins, and it allowed me to be free, to be playful, to be kind of silly again, and to actually enjoy something creative. And so slowly through this thing, also there was no pressure to be good. So I was allowed to be crap at it, and that was kind of freeing. And so through that, I slowly got back into writing.
Thank you for sharing that. That's really beautiful. And I feel like the playfulness is something that's actually in all of your work, like not taking form too seriously and finding the unexpected, seeing things a little differently, while also taking the work seriously at the same time. Nam, I'd love you to share a poem or two with us, if you would.
Yeah, sure. So not cool having to follow Omar. Seriously.
He would have said the same about you if it was the other way around.
I was one of the lucky ones. I got to be there last night with Marielle and Omar, and it was and is incredible. And hearing those words again and seeing it from a different angle, literally, it does open up new accesses to the work. So, yeah, incredible work. I had not prepared something because I'd told Ronnie that I would sort of go with the flow of the conversation. Unfortunately, the flow of my mind is still stuck in the raunchy rabbit hole of Felix's 500 penises. Everything that everyone has said since that moment has felt like a euphemism to me. Like when Omar said, just because you're married to someone doesn't mean that the performance will work or something. I was like, Omar, you don't want to be litigating that stuff on stage. So anyway, I thought on that front, I'd read something that I don't really read at readings, and it's called 10. The book is called 36 Ways of Writing a Vietnamese Poem, and each of the titles refers to one such way. So this is 10, Reclamatory 1. Me chink, but not so fast with console or condemn. Me chinked, self-chinked in pigeonhole and niche, notch, cranny hole, cleft, crack, cramped in here it is, and humid. It's just that in my mouth, says she. So lay back on bed, hang back head, drop jaw, unkink that magic passage straight and true. Pink, shut up, promise past the jag and glint and hard, oh. Gorgeous, gorge for gorge, dinky, not to thinky, chinkhead, oh, and oh, and oh, oh, oh. Should I read another one? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, this feels in keeping. This one's called 15 Diacritical. And the title is a dad joke. It's dire, D-I-R-E, critical. All in the tone. Give us each day our diacritics, our low and high, fall and rise, our horns and holds. Flat we are, without. You like that, no doubt. Give us our yosak, wing, ngā, hoi, nang. For ours is not your flat euphony, your squeezed, frictioned speech, but full mouth music. Tripping of water over stone-carved lingers. Rising tang of early season mango in the mouth. Trill of moonlight and wind on silk curtains, or reflected sunlight, prismatic, on rice paddies along the Bay Dalong. Coloratura descant of US bombs, scintillae of mother's ivory comb as it falls in the ivory mirror, as if through water, as if through silk, through your long black hair. Ma, high rising, is mother, is also cheek, as in slack of flesh, made gaunt, sallow from malnutrition, as in from Agent Orange, from yellow rain, from grief, as in to which I turn my face, as in turn the other. Now, grave your voice, ma, falls to but, fell conjunction, breaking what it binds, negating, making negative. Glyph fallen away now, as ma becomes ghost, as in hungry, as in of your unborn child, my unborn sister, by defoliants consumed, body burden, negating body burden, in your corrupted womb. And devil, too, as in turn that famous photo of Ho Chi Minh's face upside down to see, a cipher, see, assigned by the tilde in ma, as in we are, all of us, hooked, gaffed, dipped long and held down into the always end. Ma, tomb. To me, though, in the south that is my name, mother is mare, the dot below signifying nung is in heavy, the voice beginning at creek, at bottom, staying down, at the edge, or mare of low stridor. It is my son's wheeze, my son whom I named Peace, after ingesting sesame, mare, which makes him hard to breathe, and his tongue revolts, his skin revolts, it blisters into welts. To say mare is to speak with a smile, while from above, smiling white devils splash you with dioxin, with napalm, setting the palms on pretty fire, and you see your own mother's lifelong poise crack, mare, like lacquer on a burning mask. You feel her seed of a daughter going hot inside you, and you feel her whole body foreign, future tensed, gathered to its fast, heavy, unhatched dot. Cheers.
Thank you, Nam. I do want to flag that we'll go to audience questions shortly, so please prepare yourselves. But before that, I mean, I really wanted you to read 2 poems because I think the scope of the book and the kind of impact in the book is how different one poem is to the next and the mosaic that they form. And I think in both of those poems we hear the ways that I used the word playful earlier. You're playing with language, you're playing with English, you're playing with Vietnamese, you're playing with sound. It's such a pleasure to hear you read aloud. But I think in order to sort of play with or destabilise formal constraints or conventions, you need to first understand them, perhaps. I read an interview that you did in The Guardian where you spoke about hoping that the book can sustain a cold read as easily as an academic assault. So I'd love to just hear you talk a little about your relationship to poetic conventions and styles and how you wanted to work with or against them in 36 Ways.
Sure. Cheers. Don't we all want academic assault? It's funny. I think it's fair to say that poetry and poets and poems, maybe a lot of the time, they haven't done themselves any favours by, as you say, Felix, there's an element of gatekeeping, of dominance behaviour, of turf and territoriality, which then sort of leads into often abstruseness, a sense that, unless you know this reference or that allusion, you don't get it, therefore you don't get to come into this. And I feel as though, my first connection with poetry was entirely bodily. It was entirely limbic. It was just the rhythm. It was the deviation from the rhythm. It was these things working in tandem with blood and breath, essentially. The highwayman came riding, and I could talk about the metric elements of that, and I could talk about the scansion behind those feet and why it is that they work and what traditions they talk to. And it would inform a certain kind of reader looking for a certain kind of thing. But it wouldn't take away from the experience of the person who is just receiving the rhythm and music. And so I think my dream, my aspiration in my writing is to kind of have it work on any level and to be sort of talking within and across those levels too. And one of the figures that often comes to mind when I think about this is food, right? You want to be able to cook something and eat something that someone will just freaking love, will just enjoy, And that approach to the food, that experience with the food, is not lessened, in my mind, by the fact that that person may not know, what the cooking techniques were behind it, what the provenance of the ingredients was, all of that sort of stuff. But by the same token, if you wanted to come to that dish and understand, because what's more connected to politics, history, culture than food, right? And you wanted to understand what is the provenance of these ingredients? What is the history? What are the geopolitics of this? What are the ethics behind how it was harvested, produced, manufactured, transported, and arriving on your plate, on your palate? Then that is also enriching. And I would hope that the stuff that we read and write, that we're graceful enough to sort of allow it to exist as it is on the level at which we're approaching it, and not berating ourselves or it for not being all those other things as well.
Beautifully said, and very applicable, I think, to all 3 of your work. We do have about 5 or so minutes for audience questions, so if you'd like to ask any or all of our extraordinary panellists a question, please raise your hand and a microphone will come to you. And we've got a question about halfway back on the aisle. Are we able to get a microphone to that audience member? It's coming. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Claire Betita de Guzman. I'm also, I'm a novelist, and I'm a fan of Mr. Felix Cheong, as I live in Singapore. And I really want to ask him, I have a million questions as well to ask him still. And Felix has written poems, novels, short stories, flash fiction, and graphic novels. And I'm always curious if, when you shift genres, when you cross genres, what do you gain? What do you lose? And do you gain? Do you lose? So can you share some of your experiences about that? Thank you.
Thank you.
Great question.
Good question. Thanks, Claire. Well, for me, the starting point is always to humble myself before the genre. I know nothing. So I have to start from square one. How do I unlearn my writing habits? Because as a writer, and I'm sure Omar and Nam will agree with me, after writing for a certain number of years, you have picked up certain habits of writing. So when it comes too easily, too comfortable, that's when you know you're in a rut, because it's too easy. So when I approach a new genre like libretto writing or children's picture books, I have to humble myself and try to unlearn my writing habits. Because that's the only way for you to pick up new skills, new ways of writing, and also how to collaborate with another creative spirit in a way that is fruitful and not destructive. So once you have relearned the technique of course you have to do your research, read a lot of books in that particular genre. So once you have found a way to navigate and enter the genre, then you find a new form of expression, a new way to articulate what you need to say in that particular story or in that particular form. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, beautiful. Do we have any other questions? We'll finish with this, our last question.
G'day. Thanks panel so much. My question, it might not be applicable and it's so fine if it isn't, but I'm a creative also working over quite a few fields, and I was wondering if anyone on the panel juggled the demands of that with money and also fatherhood. If anyone was a father, if they got any tips on how you make it all happen.
Come on, Nam.
I'm actually here with my two kids at the moment, and very unsuccessfully juggling, even right now, artistic practice with fatherhood. It's a great question. Thank you for asking that. It's not one that is often asked to men, and it should be, And there are so many angles at which I could come at this. One of them would be that I came back to poetry in large part because I became a father. I just didn't have it in me to sustain the long form focus for the novel that I was working on, and I was similar to Omar. Like I was just in that sort of really dark night of the writing soul where I just didn't like anything that I was doing, wasn't doing it well enough, would use up all of my energy, and then arrive at the desk, be depleted, use up the remaining energy just to get to where I was, and then look at where I was and just think, oh, that's pretty shit, so let's just undo that. And it was just the cycle that continued, and it was poetry that, reading it and then writing it again, that allowed me to feel like I could engage with the correct joy and intensity on a linguistic level that I didn't have before. But the other thing I would say is it also changed the materiality and practicality of my life as well. You're right. I started working in TV a little bit, also through Omar, and it was at first just a way to pay the bills because I needed something that I, could try to learn, while also trying to work on the stuff that I was working on. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that because every new form you try, even if it's for like mercenary reasons at the start, you find yourself just getting really allured by that form and you want to learn about that form, and then before you know it, you're trying to learn that form and you've got another mountain to scale as well. So now, I'm very interested in screen and screen work as well. So I think part of it for me was I was so mono-focused on the novel because I knew that I had a tendency to veer off into short stories or, essays or poetry. And it was only when I had kids that I allowed myself to, go where I needed to go. And I think that really opened up my relationship with writing again.
Beautiful. We will need to end it there, but if you have more questions, I would very much encourage you to make sure that you buy these authors' beautiful books from the Festival Bookstore and meet them in the signing queue. So that's all. Please join me in thanking Nam Lee, Felix Cheong and Omar Musa.
Thank you.
Veronica Sullivan.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you, Ronnie.